Professional appointments. Professional appointments for auditors of public listed companies. Professional appointments. Professional appointments for public listed entities. For public listed entities. Public listed entities are entities that are listed on the Securities Exchange. And the professional appointments for auditors of public listed entities are a critical process that demands utmost transparency, that demands adherence to regulations, and also focus on maintaining auditor independence. So when appointing auditors for public listed entity, there are various aspects that must be taken seriously. And one is utmost transparency. Because these entities are owned by the public listed entities. These are entities that are not private. These are entities that are owned by the public. And therefore, in the process of appointing auditors for these public listed entities, is critical to pay attention to transparency and also adherence to regulations. You recall that we noted earlier on that public listed entities operate in a stricter regulatory environment. Almost every aspect of these organizations is regulated by legislation and by regulations, by regulatory requirements that are issued by the Capital Markets Authority, the Securities Exchange, guidelines, and so on. So when appointing auditors for public listed companies or entities, then that process must adhere to regulations. And the focus must be on maintaining auditors' independence. Maintain of auditors' independence. Professional appointment. One key factor to consider is the auditor's independence. That's why there are guidelines that ensure that there is no threat whatsoever as to the auditor's independence when it comes to the appointment of auditors for public listed entities. You understand? So there are the appointments, before I forget, I can say, are also highly regulated to safeguard the interests of the shareholders. And you need to understand that the shareholders' interests, first of all, must be protected. And one way to protect the shareholders' interests is to ensure that every aspect, including the professional appointment of auditors, every aspect of an organization is regulated. And all these regulations are for the purposes of safeguarding the interests of the shareholders and also ensuring that there is integrity of financial reporting. All right? So when discussing professional appointments candidates, take note that one key factor is regulatory framework. You understand? Regulatory framework. Let me emphasize key aspects. Let me emphasize what I think is important when it comes to professional appointment. One, I've said regulatory framework. If you are sitting on a board or you are sitting in an audit committee and you are to help in the appointment of an auditor for a public listed company, number one, regulatory framework is important. And we know one aspect of regulatory framework is mandatory audit tendering. Mandatory audit tendering. Just as we mentioned when talking about tendering. Mandatory tendering. Mandatory. Public listed companies, it is mandatory. Mandatory audit tendering. This happens in many jurisdictions. In many jurisdictions, mandate that public listed entities periodically tender their audit services to ensure auditors' independence and also to prevent what we call familiarity, to prevent complacency. Because when an auditor sits or audits a company for a long time, there is that familiarity threat. There is also complacency on the part of the auditor, and that may impair or may injure his independence. You understand? So this process involves, the tendering process involves inviting proposals from various audit firms, evaluating their qualifications, and selecting the most suitable firm. Regulatory framework. Let me also emphasize auditors' independence. Auditor independence. Because as we discuss the management of audit practice, candidates, don't forget the concept behind auditing. An audit is an independent examination of the financial statements of an entity. Independent examination. It is an independent, objective examination of the financial statements. I want you to underline independence. So an audit can only be independent. The audit process can only be independent if the auditor is independent. And here we're discussing the independence, auditor's independence, the independence of an auditor of a public listed entity. Okay? Public listed entities which are highly regulated. So regulations strictly enforce auditor independence in order to prevent any conflicts of interest that might compromise the objectivity of the audit, and that includes restrictions on financial and personal relationship between the auditors and the client company. Regulations, regulatory framework, we also have what you call shareholder involvement. The appointment or reappointment of auditors often requires shareholders' approval at the company's annual general meeting. So if you are sitting on an audit committee that is mandated to appoint the auditor, ensure that the company adheres to the regulatory requirement that such an appointment has to be approved by the shareholders in an annual general meeting. Because ultimately, the auditor of public listed companies has to report to the shareholders. That is one aspect of auditor's independence. Is hired by the shareholders, reports to the shareholders, and that makes the auditor independent. The auditor does not report to the responsible party. The auditor does not report to the management. It reports to the shareholders, and therefore the shareholders who ultimately approve the appointment of an auditor of a public listed entity. So that is one key aspect, regulatory framework. Another key aspect is selection. And candidates were discussing professional appointment. The selection process. Number 2, selection process. I've been mentioning about the audit committee. Now, the audit committee, which is an independent body within the company's board of directors, typically plays a key role in overseeing the auditor selection process. Because it is this audit committee that evaluates proposals. It is the audit committee that interviews potential auditors and then makes recommendations to the board. Audit committee. Now, an audit committee, candidates, is a committee of the board of directors. The board of directors operates committees. So an audit committee is one of the committees that comprises of a section of the board of directors. There may be another committee known as maybe risk management committee. You may have another committee known as, say, remuneration committee, and so on. So there is this auditor committee. Okay, the audit committee. Let me put it that way. The audit committee. An audit committee is an independent body within the company's board. Independent. It is independent because the directors who sit on this audit committee are non-executive directors. The auditors who sit on the audit committee are non-executive directors. That is to say, they are not involved in the day-to-day operations. Let me put it that way. And they oversee the selection process of the auditor of a public listed entity. I've said they evaluate the proposals, they interview the potential auditors, and they also make the recommendations to the board, which then submit recommendations to the shareholders for approval. Under selection process, we also have what we call evaluation criteria. Evaluation criteria. Now, the selection criteria, the procedure, the criteria of selecting may include factors like the audit firm's experience, the expertise in the relevant industry. It may include the reputation for quality and independence of the auditors. The criteria may also involve proposed audit approach. What will the audit approach of the audit firm if selected in the process of auditing? So in selecting the auditor of a public listed entity, there is an evaluation criteria. Because first of all, there is we talked about tendering. The firm may invite auditors to submit their tenders. Then the tenders may be evaluated using the criteria I'm trying to describe. The experience of the auditor, the integrity of the auditor, the proposed audit approach, the fee structure. Do you understand? Another key aspect under selection process, the third aspect here is the transparency and disclosure. Transparency and disclosure. Transparency and disclosure. Public listed entities are generally required to disclose details of the auditor selection process, including the evaluation criteria, the reasons. All right? The reasons for selecting the chosen auditor. It has to be transparent. If there are any potential conflicts of interest, that also has to be disclosed. So public listed entities are generally required to disclose details of the auditor selection process. Details. Open. It has to be open. What else do we need to say? What else? What else? Yeah, terms. We have to, of course, we are talking about professional appointment. This subtopic is not complete without mentioning the terms. The terms of appointment. Terms of appointment. Terms of appointment. And one key aspect of terms of appointment is the term limits. What is the minimum, for example, term limit what is the minimum term limit. Minimum term limit. Now, regulations may impose maximum term limits. Regulations may impose that an auditor should not run or should not be appointed or selected for a certain period of time. So regulations may impose maximum term limits for audit firms to ensure periodic rotation and also prevent long-term relationships that are likely to compromise independence. So regulations may provide maximum, it should be maximum, not minimum, maximum term limits. There may also be a cooling off period, what we call cooling off period. Cooling off period. Now, after an audit firm term ends, there may be a mandatory cooling off period before the same firm can be reappointed for further engagement. Cooling off. So depending on regulations, candidates. So that's what we can say, candidates, in relation to the professional appointments for public listed companies. But I see we are required also to cover for the non-public. We are turning every stone. We are not skipping anything. We are turning every stone. No stone shall be left unturned. No stone. Now that you've understood professional appointment for public listed entities, understanding the one for non-public will be easier. Non-public entities. These are entities that are not listed. Non-public listed entities are entities that are not listed. And if I was to ask you to say something about the professional appointment of auditors for non-public entities, definitely you have to say something about regulations. They are generally less regulated and more flexible than those for public listed entities. But be that as it may, professional standards and even ethical considerations still guide the process to ensure competence, independence, and also quality of the audit services. You understand? So there are various aspects of the professional appointments for auditors for non-public listed entities. So we'll briefly highlight the appointment process. Appointment process. The appointment process. What is the appointment process? Now, in most cases, the company's directors are responsible for appointing the auditor in most cases. In most cases. It is the company director's decision. The appointment. Company director's decision. For the public listed entities, we saw that it is the decision of the shareholders through the annual general meeting. But for non-public listed entities, the decision to appoint an auditor majorly rests with the company's directors. They may consider recommendations from the audit committee or other stakeholders, but the final decision rests with the board. Engagement letter. So the board appoints. Then once an auditor is selected, an engagement letter is prepared outlining the terms and conditions of the engagement, including the scope of the audit, the fees, and the rest of it, the responsibilities of both the auditor and the client, and so on. The auditor is appointed. The auditor may draft the letter outlining the responsibilities, the scope, and other details of the contract. There may also be sometimes need for shareholder approval. The directors may appoint, but there are situations where, the directors may appoint, but there are situations where the shareholders may have to approve. So in some cases, particularly for larger private companies or those with specific governance structures, shareholders' approval may be required for the auditor's appointment. Shareholder approval. Let me be specific. If applicable. If applicable. Shareholder approval, if applicable. One. Two, selection criteria. What can we say about the selection criteria for appointment of an auditor for a non-public listed entity? What is required here? The criteria that the company may follow is professional competence, first of all, and independence. Professional competence and independence. That is what the company will look for. Competence. Isn't it not obvious? That is the primary consideration. Is the auditor's competence. That is a primary consideration. The competence and independence. The independence and competence to perform the audit objectively and in accordance with professional standards. Is the auditor competent? Does the auditor have the right skills, knowledge to carry out the assignment? That's the first criteria. Experience and expertise is a factor to consider when appointing an auditor for a non-public listed entity. Experience and expertise. The auditor's experience and expertise in the relevant industry or sector are important. These are important factors to consider. Fee structure must also be taken into account. The fee structure. Now, while quality is paramount, cost considerations often play a more significant role in the appointment of auditors of non public listed entities, the cost. Personal relationships. When appointing auditors for non-public listed entities, the aspect, the issue of personal relationship is a key, because in some cases, personal relationships or recommendations from trusted advisors may influence the selection process. Personal relationships, let me add, and recommendations. This is in contrast to the appointment of auditors of listed public entities. Here, an accountant can recommend, one director can recommend an auditor. Can, I'm saying in some cases. Personal relationships and recommendations from trusted advisors. It could be from the board and so on. So personal relationships. So lastly, this is number 2, 1, 2, 3. Lastly, we can discuss number 3, terms of appointment. Terms of appointment. Now, candidates, unlike public listed entities, there are generally no mandatory rotation requirements, generally, for auditors of public and non-public listed entities. No mandatory rotation. That may be part of the terms of appointment. No mandatory rotation. Then we also have continuity and relationship building. Relationship and continuity building. Non-public entities often prioritize continuity and building long-term relationships with the auditors, fostering trust and understanding, which fosters trust and understanding. Which fosters trust and understanding. Professional appointment, we've discussed professional appointments for public listed entities and non-public entities. So thank you. We meet in our next session where we continue with the topic management of audit practice. Bye-bye.